We'll get rolling. Is that okay? Yeah, you've got no, you can't get away, and we'll find. Oh, can you all hear me okay? Thanks very much for joining us this evening. I'm Michael Green. I'm the new CEO and professor running the U.S. Studies Center, and I've been here for a little over a month. And we are really excited to begin again in this hopefully post-COVID era we are entering with a regular series of visiting distinguished scholars and lecturers. And I gather probably the first since early 2020. So it's really nice to be doing this in person and to have as our first lecturer, Dr. Keisha Brown. We will, just to do a little advertising up front, have a pretty regular cadence now of distinguished scholars and lecturers, none as good as the first we're about to hear from, but at least one a month, so stay tuned. The next one is October 27th, just a few weeks away. Jane Coaston from the New York Times is going to join us and give a bit of a preview of the midterm elections for the US Congress and other races in the country. And then later in November, we'll have Louis Lauder, who was head of congressional relations for the Pentagon, and is going to talk about the elections after the fact, in particular what it means for foreign affairs, defense, AUKUS, and the alliance. And we'll have a regular cadence of visitors after that, and look forward to having you join us for public discussions and then a variety of engagements with the university and students and other stakeholders. Keisha Brown's on her first trip to Australia, and is here from Tennessee State University, where she's an associate professor in the Department of History, Political Science, Geography, and Africana Studies in the College of Liberal Arts, where she joined in 2015. She received her BA from the University of Notre Dame with a double major in American Studies and Chinese, with her PhD from USC, the University of Southern California. She's a historian, she's many things. She's a historian of modern China, but she has associated interests in topics ranging from race and ethnic studies to post-colonial theory, social and cultural history in modern East Asia, and in particular, understanding what she terms, and we'll hear more about, Sino-Black Relations. And some of you will know her publication, Blackness in Exile, W.E.B. Du Bois' role in the formation of representations of Blackness as conceptualized by the Chinese Communist Party, which was a fascinating book and launched her scholarly trajectory of really examining, I'm an international relations expert, so I think of it as subnational relations, which are increasingly critical and have some relevance, I think, for Australia and for Australia's relationship with China and with the United States. I came from Georgetown University, where I was the director of Asian studies, and after the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Movement, we wanted to provide more context for our students and scholars about the Black experience in Asia, Chinese views of Blackness, all of this. And Professor Brown spoke, and our students were absolutely mesmerized, loved it, and the scholars as well. So when I came here and thought who I would want to get to really put context around a lot of things that are happening in the United States, but not just in the US and US-China relations, and in China, we could not do better than Professor Keisha Brown. Just briefly to round out her introduction, she has a number of other distinguished appointments that give her real perspective on US-China relations in particular, including she's a PIP, which I forgot what it stands for, but it's a partner. Anyway, the National Committee on US-China Relations selects a limited group of rising scholars of China and makes them basically fellows, and called PIPs, and very elite group. And Professor Brown is one of the PIPs with the National Committee. She's one of the core leaders and founders of the Black China Caucus, which is one of two major groups that have formed in the United States in the last few years to amplify, examine, network, and build on expertise among African Americans on Asia. The caucus focuses on China. There's another group that focuses on Asia more broadly, and it's a really significant part of the American engagement with the region and the pipeline of historically underrepresented scholars and students focusing on this region is really growing in the US. And Professor Brown has had a lot to do with building that pipeline and that consciousness. So a real thought leader and scholar, really interesting, relevant work for us. I'm going to invite Professor Brown to give remarks. I'll ask a few questions and then we'll open it up for your questions. And I should welcome our viewers on YouTube. We'll also, I think, have this on our website so people can go back later and take a look. Professor Brown, thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Dr. Green, for that amazing introduction. I was sitting there thinking, I don't know who the person is that you're speaking about, but thank you so much. It is my honor and privilege to be here. So thank you to the University of Sydney, thank you to the United States Studies Center, to Dr. Green and everyone who is part of the USSC for making my visit possible and also being so hospitable and inviting me to come to my first trip to Sydney, and it has been an amazing trip and experience. So thank you all for that. So when I began my research many years ago, I started this research back in 2007, actually, when I began my research looking at questions of race and thinking about the idea about Blackness in the Chinese space. It was one that was not an easy path to take, but it was one that was important to me because it was in some ways thought through, or in some ways connected to my own lived experience. It was also an experience that had not been talked about or thought through in a lot of the scholarship, where in many cases the meta-narratives were in some ways missing the other narratives, the other experiences and voices that shaped this particular relationship. So for example, we think about in American history, the idea of China being opened again, the idea of it was Nixon's visit, that is important. But what we don't always talk about is the fact that his visit was so successful, thinking about the cultural diplomacy, how to in some ways navigate that space beyond the political conversations, was through the work and experiences of Robert F. Williams, an African-American man who with him, his wife and his kids, they sought refuge and exile in China, escaping issues of racism in the United States of America. And so their experience living in Beijing, working in Beijing, having that kind of connection to the PRC and understanding what politics looks like, both the major, but also the micro ways of navigating that space was possible. And so for me, learning these different histories allowed me to think through these questions more critically. How do we think about these narratives, these different state actors, and also these non-state actors who are part of these conversations? When I began this research, I was trying to think about a framework, because there was very little that in some ways allowed me to think about navigating a space where I'm looking at individuals and connections to a nation state. And through the work of myself and my advisor, Dr. Keisha Goldstein, we thought through and kind of thought about this framework of Sino-Black relations, what happens when these two different diasporas meet, and how we think about those moments where it in some ways goes beyond state to state, think about transnational actors, both organizations and individuals. And so this research of mine I began to look into allowed me to think through critically, one, Black internationalism in a different space, beyond thinking about Europe and thinking beyond that kind of space where we think about in terms of the Black diaspora going to places in Europe, think about France, et cetera, but in many cases overlooking the ways in which they made their way to China. And for me, that was important because if you think about the time period of the Cold War era, going to China was not as simple as getting on a plane and getting a ticket. It was at risk of losing your passport and even the part of having to be in self-imposed exile because they were not seen as a thought-through ally. And so what is at risk? What is at stake? And why was it important to make that journey and travel to a place in some ways that was in some ways different from your own particular home space? What does it mean to take yourself out of what you know and to go halfway across the world? And why was that significant? And so thinking through Sino-Black relations, I look at the meanings of both China and the Black diaspora more broadly. And my initial research began looking at African Americans from the 1950s and 60s and thinking through this conversation of why then and why China, and what was in some ways the connection between those two cultures. When I began my research, it's primarily based in Chinese history and thinking through this conversation of the 20th century. What was the PRC doing when they were engaging with African Americans, a people in the United States who were not seen as powerful or as privileged or in some ways having a position of authority? What was in some ways engaging about connecting with them, aligning with them, and made them in some ways people who they wanted to support, as Mao Zedong did in his 2 speeches in both 1963 on the eve of the March of Washington, and also in 1968 after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in Memphis, Tennessee. And so thinking through these conversations, inviting African Americans to come, having them go as different roles, either as cultural ambassadors, as those who are teachers and educators, such as Vicki Garvin, who went to Shanghai and then Beijing, where she was teaching graduate students English through African American history, and these questions of what about this particular moment. And so for both sides, there is a conversation to be had. With African Americans going, it was a possibility of an imagining, a freedom dream, as Dr. Kelly said in his book, the idea of China as its possibility, a space of hope and opportunity that in many cases was not available in the then very racialized, divisive American context. Also, on top of that, in many cases, how is China trying to find a way into the United States through a means of thinking about and engaging in making connections to different peoples and cultures? How to in some ways engage through the issues of labor, issues of race, and how in some ways those are both aligned but misaligned through the ways in which they're to discuss. In addition to Mao Zedong's posters, speeches about African Americans, there are also posters, culture propaganda that in some ways also highlight and engage with the history of African American civil rights movement. And so thinking through these conversations, I was very struck by the fact that all this material was there, but yet no one had written about it. And I was confused as to why this rich history had in some ways not been combined or coalesced, but also thinking through the role of agency. What does it mean for individuals to make decisions that in some ways can really impact and shape how they think about themselves and the world around them? And so thinking through this research, I was thinking through and engaging with the history of how this opens up new possibilities through the lens of not only African American history, modern Chinese history, but also thinking through in terms of Black internationalism, where we now include Asia as a space and a site for political and critical engagement. And so thinking through this particular moment and its history in terms of the post-war, now in some ways, we talked today earlier in this amazing workshop I had today of thinking through the long 20th century history, not just the post-war period, but also thinking about the interwar prior as well, where the foundations were laid, how we had these kind of conversations, and again, what made Asia this space, a possibility, but also what was their understanding of Black Americans, Black diaspora, and how does this connect to the ways in which we think about the contemporary moment. So thinking through Sino-Black relations, I look at it broadly and thinking about this history as one that changes over time. If I look at some of the moments where I look at it through a particular lens, we look at the cultural, sometimes the political, and sometimes we see both coming together. So for example, in terms of looking at China as a site of exploration, I think about the early 20th century and how in many cases, post-Qing dynasty, early Republican era, it was one of a cultural exchange, thinking through the African-American musicians, authors, writers who were going to China, circulating and exchanging culture at a moment when China, in its early phases of modernity, was trying to understand who China is, what makes China, who is Chinese. And so thinking through this moment, you have different musicians who are going, such as Buck Clayton and his band, the Harlem Gentlemen. There's a really interesting narrative about when they go. They actually get into, they're in Shanghai. They are playing at different clubs, and they talk about, in some ways, why China was a possibility for them. And they said, quote, the United States, they go through the back door. We have to be treated as second-class citizens. We don't get half the pay as our other counterparts. But in China, we're able to go through the front door, be treated as humans and have human dignity and still be able to perform and curate our art to an audience who in some ways appreciates what we're doing. And even in a space where they in some ways are still facing racism from their other foreign counterparts, the Chinese populace embraces them because of the ways in which their music transcends some of the issues they have, but also how they see themselves as both being oppressed by Western European imperialism. But we also have the moment of also culture through literary expression. People like Langston Hughes who travel here as well, who make their way to China in the early 20th century and thinking through the ideas as he talks about his book, I Wonder as I Wander, and also reflected later in his poem, Roar China, his experiences and understandings about China he experienced and saw in the early 20th century. We also see a shift in terms of thinking about the political engagement, where we see it in many cases post-1949, The relationship is framed as one of politics, one of think through the lens of communism, and through, as Anne-Marie Brady says in her book, Making the Foreign Serve China, how this particular relationship allows for Mao to rethink how engaging with these conversations can make American imperialism implode. Aligning with and thinking through race as America's Achilles tendon, and how this becomes a moment of both alignment, but also a moment to where we can put pressure on the United States in ways that we can think through and engage with. And in many cases, as we see in some ways kind of post 1976, how we see both examples of both, where it becomes a cultural and a political exchange. And thinking through culture, not just in terms of pop culture, things such as rap music, films, television, other examples of cultural expression, but also through sports, also through the idea of also political exchanges and thinking through Black internationalism in a new space that allows for new exploration. And so when I think about these kind of conversations as it relates to China and Sino-Black relations, I have a few kind of misgivings, because while it sounds good, we know there are always some other sides to every particular situation. In recent years, especially in light of COVID, we've seen in many cases the rise of conversations about race on both sides of this particular relationship, whether it's the United States making conversations and critiques about what's happening in China, and China also saying things about what's happening in the United States. While the Black Lives Matter movement began in 2013, after George Zimmerman was exonerated after he murdered Trayvon Martin, we do see in many cases how the movement gained national and international prominence in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. And how in many cases, this particular situation, the protests, the frustrations over violence at the hands of authority figures against Black bodies who have been racialized for centuries in American context, amidst the frustration of COVID, quarantine, all these different pressures mounting to lead to an explosion of frustrations and peaceful protests in many different cities. But in many cases, how the particular coverage was in some ways talked about, we see in many cases how race becomes a new part of the geopolitical context in ways that we have not seen before. Well, as I mentioned before, in the Maoist era, the idea of race as America's issue was always raised. We see in some ways new stakes being attached to this in light of the shift in geopolitics and the state of which both the United States and China find themselves in today. And so one of the things I'm kind of still grappling with is thinking about is in terms of moving beyond performative politics, where both sides are engaging with and passing policies or making laws or making declarations about the other's state of affairs, how to go from in some ways making declarations to actually having real solid conversations, actual policies in light of changing these particular initiatives. How to go beyond saying race is an issue, race in some ways is a part of a problem, systemic, and in some ways part of both different societies, however they frame it. So thinking about the China context, it might not be seen as race, but it is a difference with distinction, as we've seen happening in many different cases. But again, the question of what do we do in these particular places and spaces where many times the role, those who involve, the consequences involved, the bodies who are impacted by it are in some ways putting political pawns in these particular games. And so I'm wondering how we can move beyond the idea of performative politics, beyond the idea of using propaganda, and using and leveraging as us versus them to think about these questions more broadly in a kind of contemporary context. And so thinking about the idea of what we do with race and diversity within the geopolitical space, and how do we cover these particular moments and move beyond the same old tropes, moving beyond the tropes of saying this is bad, this is a problem, how do we in some ways put particular policies behind it? While I applaud in some cases the initial acts being taken by different institutions on both sides, I'm still wondering what is the long-term game? And we're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, particularly in the American space, what does that look like moving forward? And so as I'm thinking through these conversations, I'm thinking through also the idea of how do we in some ways engage and empower those who are impacted to also challenge and push forward and engage in those conversations to push these two geopolitical institutions to think about these questions in a way that's both critical, but also in some ways allows for them to be done that is unique in particular to those particular spaces. So with that being said, I know I'm asking a whole lot. I know that talking about race is not always the most popular topic, but in many cases, it's all about how do we think about who is the populace in those places? What are the tensions and solidarities? How do we build collective bargaining? How to build collective institutions across different places? And I'll leave you with this on a positive note, because I'm always at my 15 minutes, is that one thing that I've really been struck by in this particular moment of crisis, when thinking about the ways in which we see the rise of anti-Asian hate, along with other moments in this last couple of years, is the possibility of thinking about coalition building. There is a history of coalition in Afro-Asian politics, not only in the US, but also across the globe, where individuals, both in terms of institutions, organizations, have thought through and have shaped each other and helped each other think about what it means to move forward, to have that particular vision of how to fully live their own individual lives. And so thinking about this moving forward, how do we think about actual building new solidarities? How do we go beyond, in some ways, the idea of making statements and declarations, but actually putting action behind those words to where these, and so it was said the subnational, or kind of in some ways, these transnational organizations can think about and challenge and push these large institutions to really start to be able to engage and move forward so that we do not have the same rhetoric that we saw from the Maoist era that we see today be in some ways a new template 30 years from now as well. With that being said, I will stop there. Thank you. I'm scared.
So that was a really elegant introduction to a lot of Professor Brown's work on contemporary US-China relations, the history of Sino-Black relations, the agency and experience of African-American actors over 120 years of history. And so there's a lot of rich stuff for the people in the audience to engage Keisha on, but let me start with a few questions. I'm intrigued by the, I knew a bit about the African-American experience in China from your work, but I'm intrigued by how Mao and the Chinese Communist Party thought about African Americans and American politics. And you said rightly they saw it as an Achilles heel for the US. And historically, race has been a huge Achilles heel. Treaty of Versailles, at the beginning of World War II, actually the Japanese mobilized more support in Asia because we were on the side of the imperial masters. And there's lots of cases where it's not just propaganda and narrative, it has been an Achilles heel for American foreign policy. And so it's not surprising Mao would target that. You know, Ho Chi Minh claimed in the Vietnam War that he had witnessed a lynching in the South, but he'd never been to the US. There's no evidence he had. So it's an easy propaganda tool. So what I wanted to try to explore with you is, did Mao's China ever go beyond using it as propaganda? Can you tell us about how they, and to the extent to which they actually tried to engage, it, not just for propaganda, but in a more substantive way, or was it just propaganda? That's the first question for you, because it's a fascinating period in American and Chinese history.
So that's a good question. What happens is that we see at the national level, in terms of government, where in many cases it does stay at the kind of propaganda level in terms of the outreach that actually makes its way back to America. But in terms of actual concrete actions, we do see that the CCP invites different African Americans who also have a national, also international platform to make their way to China, which is how they invite Du Bois, his wife, why they invite Robert Williams, and even including Vicky Garvin through the ambassador to Ghana, Huang Hua, who was actually in some ways a kind of a connective between African Americans going from America to Ghana to then making their way to China. And so there is that particular action taken where they're supported, they're invited over. But in terms of actual support for African Americans in the US, I mean, it really does not go beyond the idea of them knowing that these speeches exist and it happens. So for example, there is a beautiful image and where we see Angela Davis is in the Black Panthers headquarters, and there's a Chinese propaganda post behind her. So we know that the iconography does reach America, but beyond that, it's not in some ways go beyond actual tangible support. But what it does do in terms of support is that it means that they also know there is an external institution, organization, and country that also supports them, whether that's intangible, not that you know that they have that proper other support. In terms of the everyday Chinese citizen, that is a level that I'm still trying to engage with, because they're putting these reports in the newspaper and they're saying they're reprinting these papers and Mao's speech, every year. And so there is an awareness of it where they're also reprinting stories from the Black press, United States. So they're in some ways aware of what's happening in terms of the civil rights movement. But I'm not sure in some ways how that level of understanding trickles down to the everyday. But it is something that it is saturating the press to where there is an awareness at some level that these things are happening because it's in the press. But again, that's for a particular audience, because you have to be in some ways the literate public to understand and know that particular press and be in some ways those spaces. But there is an understanding. But beyond that, but again, even if it is propaganda, that there is some kind of external support, does galvanize in different ways these different particular institutions, because they in some ways feel that they're not alone, and they have some kind of external support from a different source, whether it's not just China, but also kind of goes and connects back to the kind of Chungmanist connections that many cases we see in the early 20th century with Black organizations and Black grassroots organizing.
And how broad in the African American community and the civil rights movement did that resonate? So with the Black Panthers, yes, but did it resonate with Reverend Martin Luther King, for example? Did it resonate with, there's a whole full spectrum in that Black experience in the civil rights movement. How broad was the impact of the Chinese?
It galvanized. It in some ways resonated more with the individuals who come after Robert Williams and those who become in some ways more of kind of what we see like the young people who move away from the kind of idea of nonviolence to a more radicalized aspect of the Black Power movement. And so in many cases, their ideology aligns with Maoist ideology as it's starting to evolve in this time period where we see as Robert Williams is in China, he's writing about it, and the way in some ways his ideas about armed self-resistance, where I'm not going to go out and attack someone, but ideas that if someone does come ways attack me, I have the right to defend myself, my family from violence, where while the nonviolent approach might be useful, that is not the one him as a former soldier in some ways is willing to apply. And so in some ways allows him to think about and think through this element of Black power and how that really does in some ways resonate with them to the point where we see Maoist ideology, for example, Maoists talk about the uniform, about art, not for just art's sake, how that in some ways shapes the ideas, and how we see the Black Panthers kind of propaganda posters coming out where they have, iconography that in some ways anyone could recognize, understand, or how they're also selling Mao's little red books and kind of thinking through that, where they're not incorporating just his ideology, but it becomes one element of their way of thinking. So it becomes more resonant with the Black Power movement that we see coming out of that moment.
And it coincides with Maoist world revolution and the Sino-Soviet split, and also Mao's increasing intervention and engagement in Africa, in particular Angola. Was that a part of the Chinese calculation, do you think? Or did that make it resonate more with the Chinese who were reading this propaganda?
It was very intentional because Zhou Enlai was doing African safaris very early in his time as the foreign minister. And a lot of that.
When you say African safaris, you mean literally Zhou Enlai was going on safari?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was going on safari. And one thing that happened is that what was going on is that China was seeing himself as part of this emerging third world. And what does it mean to be aligned with this non-alignment, outrage, solidarity that was coming out post-1945? And so in many cases, it was very intentional to build those relationships. And Du Bois was very much a part of it because he goes to Beijing in 1959. He gives a speech at Beida. He says, Africa and China unite. And so his, in some ways, a platform, his stature in the African, kind of Pan-African, African diasporic world in some ways was able to give China kind of the leverage or the credibility, because in many cases, different countries were in some ways on the fence about should we not. Everyone is in some ways thinking about how do we engage with these different new political actors as new emerging independent nation states, and how in many cases, a lot of the relationships or the future relationships that come out of the kind of China-African relations is in many cases built by him, in some ways giving China their kind of credibility. So it was very much particular part of their foreign relations agenda, because you look at the Maoist speeches, is, Africa, Asia, Latin America arise. Like they have this kind of larger kind of context, but they also include African Americans who are a people who are some ways oppressed, but in many cases in the same ways, but also they're not a people with their own nation state. They're still included in terms of this idea of combating Western imperialism.
So jumping from Mao's China to Xi Jinping's China.
That's a big jump.
That's a big jump. And because you also do contemporary U.S.-China relations, and many China scholars, you used to hear Xi is the most powerful leader since Deng Xiaoping, but increasingly you hear he's the most powerful leader since Mao. The narrative about the United States coming from Xi Jinping's China is once again very, very negative. There's a major social mobilization campaign by the party. You don't have to go much further than Global Times and the People's Daily to find a nice, delicious selection of critiques of American society and flaws in democracy and hypocrisy. And so, again, targeting the Achilles heel. But this time, it's not a revolutionary China. It's a China seeking great power status, and some would say hegemonic status. So it's a different context. It's not revolutionary. It's not helping repressed or underrepresented people in the same way. Does it resonate? Does Xi Jinping's China resonate among African American intellectuals now, or is it not? Does it not work? Because it's not really about, I can understand very well the Maoist revolutionary appeal to Black Panthers and others who were impatient and want to change. But with Xi's China, is the Chinese approach to the Black community in the United States, is it similarly calculated, targeting, or is it just propaganda?
Just take a step back. There's, in some ways, I think in the current moment, there's not the same actual targeting in terms of thinking about engagement with America, where there's some ways have different ends. And I don't think we see in some ways, unfortunately, with the kind of opening up of U.S.-China bilateral relations in 1972, we don't see that same level of engagement with different organizations in terms of where they were actually seeking out engaging, where we do have evidence where the Panthers do actually make their way to China. We don't see that level of engagement anymore. What is very much engaging with African-American organizations, institutions directly. And so what we see now is that there's a different level where they're in some ways using or engaging in conversations about race in a way that it's not some ways being embraced by African-American organizations, because they know in many cases there is not a lot of actual support behind it. It's just a matter of we're retaliating against what the U.S. said about us, and therefore we want to use it in that way. So in many different organizations, for example, they were, when the Chinese individuals, the CCP wrote, we can't breathe on like their Twitter account. It was not something that was necessarily retweeted by different organizations, including Black Lives Matter, because it was not one that had a lot of really weight behind it, because they were like, well, was this engagement before or since? And so there was a different level where it's not even, I don't know if it's in propaganda, but it's in some ways used as a propaganda tool, maybe more so in the China space, but not in some ways in terms of the US space, where there's not a level of at least an attempt to make it seem like there's a long-term engagement where we saw in the Maoist period.
Interesting.
And so while there are different moments, not to mention also the fact that you can do that one moment, but then every other year or every couple of years, we still see the use of blackface in the Chinese New Year celebration. Or we see these moments where we have these racial incidents where it's like, how can you say one thing, but then also go back and not learn from this previous moment before, or you have to continuously say, why is this use of blackface happening? And so I think that awareness of what's happening more so is allowing for a lack of connection, but also thinking through in some cases where there also is a shift where a lot of the organizations and movements in the United States that deal with these questions about race are focusing very much on the domestic space in different ways, where we don't see the outreach or trying to use the international space we saw in the civil rights movement as well. So I think on both sides, their approach is different, what they're putting weight to is different, and in some ways they're missing each other.
Interesting. You can imagine Mao Zedong, who, fomented the Cultural Revolution, who liked street protests a lot, having a different view from Xi Jinping, who does not like street protests, right? Who has a very different view of power and the modalities of China's role in the world. I'm a Japan scholar originally, and Japan-US relations were terrible in the 1980s, terrible. In 1988, more Americans thought Japan was a threat than the Soviet Union because of economic friction, trade friction, and racism. There was a lot of racism in Japanese public political narratives and culture, and to some extent in Korea as well. And in order to overcome, as part of this national strategy and corporate strategy, overcome that overall friction, but also the racially charged problems they had with the African American community, Japan and Korea engaged. They don't do it as much now, but they supported HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. Companies like Nissan and Toyota began marketing specifically for the African American consumer. And it's interesting, if China had a smart soft power strategy, you'd think they would engage more. But what you're telling me is really it's not happening.
It's not happening in a way that is sustained or seems as intentional. It seems in some ways where it's reactionary to what's happening. I think that's where the frustration lies, where it's using the struggle and in many cases overlooking the fact that these are people and these are actions that are taken, and you're using the particular pain and particular struggles to make a point targeted at the government and higher administration more
scoring points, propaganda points. Your work, Mark Alicia's work, looking at American struggle in Asia is particularly interesting because, for example, Mark's work looks more at Japan, but how the Black community did not feel the same sense of threat from Japan as the American public more broadly. There was a different reaction to rising powers and challenges. And in a way, you could say other groups in the United States vis-a-vis Europe were similar. The Irish Americans, German Americans were very opposed to intervening in World War I and World War II for their own historical reasons. But historically, the African American experience has been a little less quick to embrace threats or the sense of threats. So even though Xi Jinping's China is not connecting with African American leaders, communities in the United States, as you described, would it be fair to say that for the Black community, the China threat does not resonate as much as it does for America overall? Or do you think that would not be true? Because that's, and maybe I'm overusing Mark Alicia's work, but that's Mark's take, as I recall it, on the Japanese rise of the Japanese threat.
I don't think it's lost in terms of the role in which China plays and how it impacts everyday life. I don't think there's loss. I don't think it's a China threat per se. I think it's just the kind of also the framing too that can be problematic. I think it's more of a conversation of how do we, in some ways, allow people to engage with China in a way that in some ways is more nuanced. So, for example, in recent years, through the loss of like funding and opportunities, you don't have as many students going abroad to have these kind of conversations. You do have some spaces, but again, how do you create that next generation of China scholars that includes, Black students? Historically, in many cases, if you were one of African American descent, my narrative included, to do so, you had to, in some ways, be in certain positions and places to be able to have that language exposure and experiences. So I don't think it's lost on students. I think it's a matter of exposure and experiences to know exactly what's happening where, and unfortunately, through the Black China Caucus, I've been able to meet a lot of students who now they know how to get connected. They've been interested in it, but now what does it mean? I do think that in many cases, in terms of East Asia, though, you think about soft cultural diplomacy, Korea has done a better job, and so is Japan. And so you have a lot more students who are thinking through this as well. So, for example, the new statistic is that in Korean classes, the majority of new students are Black women. So in some cases, there is a still engagement with Asia, but in many cases, it's not necessarily China right now.
Yeah. We're talking about China mostly today, but it is remarkable how much soft power Japan and Korea have across the world, but particularly in the African American community, including things like, for Japan, cosplay, anime, manga, right? You teach Asian studies too. So many students come up. I used to have African American students from rural Kentucky who spoke Japanese because they fell in love with anime. So, but the China's soft power is not really having that effect.
No. And I think it's multiple. I think in many cases in the last years, we think about kind of current students, the way in which China's been framed as this kind of threat. And so a lot of times they see China as, in some ways, how we think about the way it's been framed in politics and news. It's like the China problem, the China question, this kind of thing we have to solve, whereas in other places, it's more about this is culture, this is kind of engagement through music and other ways of engagement. So I think it has to do with how we think about and frame China. And I think there's also a problem too, where we've made it to be seen as a problem to be dealt with. And a lot of times that's not something that can be appealing to students who are trying to just, learn something new in different cultural experiences.
When I was at CSIS, one of my old jobs, we did a survey of the American public about China. And we found millennials, people in their 20s, felt much less threat from China than older generations. So there is that general difference, the generational difference.
But just one other thing too, I think as well, was that one space that I think could be really a great space exploration is thinking through how China's engagement with different countries in the continent of Africa, as well as in the Caribbean, can also be a space exploration where there have been a lot of conversations about the Black diaspora more broadly, how African Americans see themselves as part of these kind of conversations, and where they're thinking through looking at China, but through the Black diaspora experience more so than through the U.S. or American U.S.-China experience. So I think there's also a space as well where they're trying to think through this engagement of what does it mean to think about the Black diaspora, how they connect to that space, and also how they're thinking through China that way in different ways. So, for example, a colleague of mine, Rashid Griffith, has an amazing podcast about China and the Caribbean, and he talks about this kind of diaspora connections and how it pulls in different conversations. Not to mention that prior to COVID, there was this huge push of, come back, come home, kind of come back to Africa, kind of push for there in some ways engaging with African Americans as part of the Black diaspora. China. And so I think there is a space where that is a moment where there could be some connection, but it's going to come through the lens of Blackness. And so if China is really thinking about engaging, then we have to think about their policies towards Black diaspora, Blackness, and race.
You mentioned earlier the increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans, which by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI numbers increased about 30% over the last 3 years, I think, if I have the numbers right. And I gathered from your statements, you're worried the narrative in the U.S. about China has too much of a racial tinge, too much of a adversarial tone to it.
Yeah. And I think also in that moment, I think for me, a lot of my students, they don't necessarily always know the history of Afro-Asian solidarity, where you have people like Grace Lee Boggs, who were with your husband, James Boggs, part of like the movement and protests and part of the civil rights movement in Detroit, or people like Yuri Kuchiyama, who's part of the Black Panthers and others who were very much engaged in these movements, or also the connection between African American studies, the creation of Asian studies, and all these different movements that are happening where they in some ways are engaging with each other. They're supporting each other, they're pushing each other to push for new ways of thinking and engaging with the different politics and academics around them. So I think for a lot of my students, it was a moment of opening, especially when they had the unfortunate mass murder of 6 women in Atlanta. And I remember that moment.
You're from Atlanta.
I'm from Atlanta. I remember
right?
I'm from there. And I remember having that moment of conversation with my students about why should we in some ways care, and what is important to think about this, and how we think about in some ways these conversations and think through the history of alignment. So I think, unfortunately, one of the positives come out of this unfortunate situation of rise of anti-Asian hate has been in some ways these communities going back to looking at those historical connections and having conversations about how to in some ways move beyond these tensions and these kind of moments of misunderstanding to think about we need to kind of come together and think through this as well. And so having those conversations, having a multitude of talks where they're talking about, okay, how do we address in some ways the kind of internal racism in our own communities towards each other, but also to move beyond that, think about what are the stereotypes and tropes to let's get beyond this idea of comparing our oppressions to think about alignments and coalitions. And that's been one of the positives that's come out of that. So in some cases, the idea of the adversary has in some ways allowed these different groups to come together and think about it, especially with a lot of students who want to see more engagement and more conversations across different lines.
China has its own ethnic minorities.
Yes.
The official narrative in China has become more Han-centric under Xi Jinping. And I was fascinated to see scholarly research on how the Black Lives Movement was picked up by ethnic minorities in this region. So for example, in West Papua, protesters began carrying signs saying West Papuan lives matter, and basically taking the Black Lives Movement in the United States and learning from it. And I know this isn't a core part of your research, but I'm curious, have you seen, not with the Chinese government or the Han Chinese minority, but with Tibetans, Uyghurs, other ethnic minorities, has there been historically much resonance from the civil rights movement in the United States in your view?
So there's been a lot of resonance. So for example, I had the opportunity to be in Hong Kong in January 2020, and we were actually at one of the sites of the protest. It was kind of a not as busy day. It was one of the different days, but it was very much using the language where it was in January. So it was around Martin Luther King holiday. And they were using the particular language of saying, I have a dream. And it was always a double play on King's speech, but also the idea of Xi Jinping's China dream. And they were in some ways using that to kind of show they wanted to have this kind of international dimension and connection, where they're very much engaged in those conversations. And you did see some people have an idea, but we did see prior to the change in laws, they were reaching out and writing and making statements about Black Lives Matter, the individuals who were part of the Hong Kong protests. So in some ways, getting support and getting guidance from each other is not new. I've seen that historically before, not just in the US, but also thinking about, for example, different movements in Japan, where they were kind of, in some ways, emulating the ethnic minorities there, when using some of the methods from the civil rights movements in the United States and other places. So I'm not surprised that was happening, but I also think, unfortunately, right now, is not, in spite of all of the new media technology, in many cases, we see that there's still a disconnect happening in some cases where there's conversations and there's support globally, but again, how did it translate into tangible support of each other is still a kind of question and conversation to be had.
Let's open it up. You've given us a really rich menu to pick from. So if you could raise your hands, I'll call on people and briefly identify yourselves. Try to keep the question a question and brief. And yeah, Gopik, I'll let you know. Go ahead.
I'm notoriously greedy with questions, so
Yes.
perhaps I should
No, you can start as long as it's
yield.
questions.
Is that the appropriate
No,
US
no,
Congress
no,
term?
no.
Okay.
The right honorable gentleman has the floor.
Tony Booth, I'm sure Simon Jackman warned you about me. I hope he did. Lots and lots of, I'm a student of more classical period of China, when basically the northern borders and the western regions were of great interest to the emerging country. And they dealt with confederations of Xiongnu, Xie, Qiang, later on Jurchens, Manchus, and most famously the Mongols, of course. Interestingly enough, there is vast amounts in the Chinese histories describing these people, much in the same way that the Greeks describe the people in Ukraine, Black Sea communities all over the world, over the known world, if you like. And the concept of how to translate some of the terms is quite interesting. Some people have used the word barbarian in the sense that someone who doesn't speak Greek, ipso facto doesn't speak Chinese. And then later on, we come to the latter period, and for your own involvement, where in the late Qing, early Republican period, you have people transferring from writing in Wenyanwen or literary Chinese to Baihua or vernacular. They don't have the terms. So what do? They borrow a lot of the terms from Japanese scholarship because Japan opened itself up during Meiji. So you get them borrowing terms from Japanese. In Chinese, you might have a word like minzu, and then a very esoteric discussion of what minzu or race, for want of a better word, means. And they describe all kinds of discussions about yellow race, blah, 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 blah. Then in the 1950s, it gets to your point about where China built railways in Tanzania, almost like a Belt and Road initiative. And then in the latter period, they've concentrated on Belt and Road. What I'm curious about is there's a gentleman called Bill Brayton at the London School of SOAS, School of African Oriental Studies, who has done a great deal of research, not just on South China Sea, which you're probably familiar with, Dr. Green, but also on the whole concept of how China or Chinese scholarship thought about the outside world and about race. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but it's incredibly detailed and highly analytical. I'm wondering, when you see all the African students who went to Beida and all that kind of thing, where they engaged with African students, in the latter years, has that dropped right off, and has their engagement changed, as you've been alluding to in your back and forth?
You're asking about African students in China, particularly?
Well, more particularly about this concept of minzu, of race, because the way they view it is subtlety of what they do is quite important, and how they treat it is quite important.
So when I think about approaching this question in the Chinese space,
we're reading it as how they've translated Western concepts, and they're trying to incorporate that in their own thinking and writing.
And so I try to be mindful of that, but also when I'm thinking about these kind of conversations, there's a lot of really good scholarship coming out in the last 5 years or so, where they're in some ways trying to go beyond the concept of just minzu, to look at in some ways how historically identity in China has been structured, to think about in some ways how identity is shaped, constructed, but also allows a broader lens of thinking about identity and classification in China that in some ways is very comes from organic in the China space. So in some ways, not necessarily just trying to apply Western concepts in this particular space, because when I first began my research, and I would say I'm looking at questions of race or racism in China, I got a knee-jerk reaction from my colleagues who are saying, we don't have racism or racists. And so I was like, okay, so how do I think about this question more broadly? And so looking at it from the perspective of thinking about, for example, lineages and blood ties and those kind of concepts. So what is a Chinese diaspora? How does it mean? What does it mean to be seen as Chinese in those kind of conversations? And also, what does it mean to be in versus out? And I think that's where I try to do a lot of that work, because the concept of minzu, in many ways, it's applied. It also has very much a kind of a foreign connotation. And what happens when you have someone who is technically Chinese? for example, they might be biracial or multiracial. One parent is Chinese, one parent is not. Does this concept still apply to them and more? Does the concept of means will still work, or do we have to look at other frameworks and ideas? So I think in many cases, there's a lot more expansion about the concept of race to where it opens up where we think about these modes of ideas of difference of distinction, but also think about ideas of where in some cases, not just in terms of means and identity, but also thinking about the larger concept. Dr. Ross has a really great piece in the New York Times about global anti-Blackness. So think about these kind of conversations, how we think about it and expand this to where we make it one unique to the space we're looking at, to us thinking about more broadly how we see different patterns happening as well. So the concept of means is useful, but I think in many cases is also limited when we think about artists and connections between how they think about the Xiaoxue Minzu versus the foreign others, and are there some parallels and connections and how we can use the way this classification happens in China to maybe think about that a little bit differently as well. So I try to go in between those. Is there a space in between them? I don't know, but there's a conversation to be had of thinking about looking at domestic versus the foreign other. What does that mean? How those kind of conversations about identity and classification, especially in light of there's so many new multi-ethnic children being born who are part Chinese and part other, who and the other is Black. And what does that mean moving forward in terms of citizenship, nationality, access, and those sort of things? So I'm trying to think about when these blend, what does that mean for the individual as well? That helps at all, if that makes any sense.
So the Chinese definition of race is a kind of an amalgam of historic Sino-centric views of the others and learned racial views from the West. Yeah. Well, the Minzu is it's Minzoku in Japanese, and for Japan in the Meiji period, I'll refrain from advertising my new book on this, but for Japan in the Meiji period, the definition of race in a hierarchical international system was a core part of what they struggled with. Because race in the Western concept was very closely tied to the hierarchy of nation states and the hierarchy of international order. Whereas for the Chinese, your point is very good. It was central kingdom and others. And it is learned in a way, but there's also a base of how now.
And I think the reason why I try to push back on that is because if we look at this kind of hierarchy, it in some ways still makes it where this conversation about identity is very Eurocentric. And I'm trying to get beyond looking at in some ways the West as this kind of center of identity, especially thinking about people who in some ways are trying to move away from it. So if we think about the hierarchy of race, how it comes out of social Darwinism, the idea of we have different races and there's, one at the top, one at the bottom, one in the middle, is very much a Eurocentric perspective that in some ways does not us think about how people see themselves in a way that can be frustrating. So thinking about the concept, how do we incorporate self-identity in addition to the ways in which identity has been traditionally constructed?
Yeah. Victoria, and then we'll get to you, sir.
Great. If I'm correct, you spent some time in China, and I'd love to hear a bit about your lived experience as a Black woman living in China and how you found that kind of scholarship and that experience, and any issues of racism or reflections on what that experience was like.
Yeah. I'm very fortunate to say that I consider China my second home. I love going back every time I get a chance to. But I will say that my first experiences, I went for the first time, I was 16. I went for a week to Beijing I was a special guest for a root-seeking summer camp of all things. So everyone around me was Chinese or Chinese American, and then there was me. So it was an interesting kind of conversation. I only had 1 year of high school Chinese, so I was very much like, I know just very little was going on because I really had like 1 year of, very, very limited Chinese in high school back in early 2000s. But I do remember in some cases where the experience was one where it allowed me to think about my identity in different ways. I am born and raised in the South, and so my parents were both born in 1950. They were part of the movement to integrate higher schools in Atlanta. And so in my household, we talk about these questions about race and identity. And I've never seen this conversation about Blackness beyond the American context. And so my experience in China was one that was eye-opening in both good and bad ways. Good in terms of thinking about myself as a global citizen and the long trajectory of Black Americans who have gone abroad, but also thinking about in many cases where there are still spaces where your Blackness can be challenged and thought about, and how in some cases in certain contexts in China that I learned when I went later in undergrad and also in grad school, where identity of Blackness and Americanness were seen as incompatible. and how we have to navigate those conversations where I'm either Black or American. What does it mean to be both? And when someone actually does realize that the very limited understanding of Black American history, where they always tell me, I remember I went to a bookstore and I was looking for books and they were like, oh, where you from? I'm American. Okay, where your parents from? They're from America. Where your grandparents? They're American. I was like, there's something called slavery. So all I know is my American side. My apologies for that. And they're like, oh, slavery, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I was like, oh, dear God. So I remember that moment of thinking like, that's the only reference. Then there has to be a gap here. So I know that thinking through, if you look at like the courses and things where I remember there's a colleague of mine who was teaching a Black American history course, but it was only at the graduate level. So there's not a lot in some ways in terms of funding going into having these courses outside of certain spaces. I know there is a growth in terms of certain fields like literature and politics, economics, where there's a growth of looking at Black American literature, womanist literature. I have a colleague, Zufan Leo, he just finished his PhD. He's looking at people like Claudia Jones and others, but he did his undergrad and graduate work in China and then came to US for his doctorate. So there is a change where there is more scholarship happening, but I just remember my experience being one of, there's a gap here in terms of what does it mean? And a lot of times, unfortunately, that gap is being filled by pop culture. And that can be problematic thinking about the information or the ways in which we think about how Blackness is portrayed in different media spaces. And so how you navigate that as a Black woman when you're sitting there and you see Norbert on TV and I'm like, that's not my female experience as a Black woman. How do you sometimes have to navigate that? But I will say one of the beautiful things about being able to speak Chinese is that I'm able to have conversations with people. And some of the best insights I've gleaned were having, Eden Chua and a Hutong in Beijing somewhere, and we're having like one-on-one conversations. And so for me, that's been those insights where that people-to-people diplomacy allows for insights from both sides to kind of learn from each other. But those have been the moments where I think it's been beneficial to have that in-person conversations. But it's not always easy to navigate in many cases. But I will say one of the things I remember is that we had a panel with BCC and Nabia, and one of our members stated about his experience in China. He was like, even though I know I have, moments of discrimination, sometimes because I'm American or because I'm Black, but I still feel safer being in China than America.
Wow.
And so that can kind of sometimes speak to that kind of conversation as well. So it comes with a grab bag, but it is, depends on where you go. If you're more the urban spaces versus rural. So some people have different experience. Some have better, some have worse. But it's just a matter of individual experience and what does it mean to be Black globally in some cases too.
Yeah. Thanks. That was a fascinating talk. My name is Jamie Riley. I teach Chinese politics here at the University of Sydney, and I also give a lecture series on the power of Black music in America. So this sort of intersects with both of my interests. Just, I guess, two questions. One, I'm really curious more about those interactions between Black nationalists, Robert Williams, even a little earlier, W. Du Bois visits there. I wonder if you could say a bit more about whatever you know about the ways in which people's experience were shaped by those sort of conversations in Beijing. And I'm thinking both on the American side. So Robert Williams, being there in China, what does it do for his thinking? The growth of internationalism and the Black Power movement of Black nationalists in that time period, W. Du Bois sort of being a lead on that. But how did that sort of being in China, thinking about China, see what's happening in the Chinese Revolution, what did it do to their sense of internationalism? How important was China in contributing to the internationalism and the Black Power movement in that time period? And conversely, for Mao or for others who interact with them, what did that do for their understanding of America? He hadn't met a whole lot of Americans. He hadn't met many Black Americans. I mean, yourself later on, So what did that do for them? Did he get a better insight into some of the vulnerabilities within the United States, a deeper insight into some sense of what was happening in American society? And I'm sorry, I'm going to piggyback one more thing, because I'm really curious about the American national security state at this time period, the harassment of Black Power activists, W. Du Bois personally, of course, but all those people were really under intense scrutiny and really repression from the American security state at this time period. So were they watching what was happening in China? They were very worried, obviously, what's happening in Cuba later on, the support that Cuba got, very worried about sort of internationalist aspects. It was really an embarrassing moment for the American security state, as Mike said earlier. It affected foreign policy. It was a big concern. Were they watching what was happening in China with any kind of concern? Sorry, it's a lot. Thank you very much. So really great talk.
Yeah. So I'm trying to unpack a little bit.
Whatever you
okay. So thinking about the second question about the security state in the United States, they were watching, which is why many of these individuals had to be creative in how they got to China. And so, for example, both Robert Williams, Du Bois, Vicky Garvin, a few others who go as well, they make their way through Ghana and then they go to China. In the case of Williams, his family, they actually escaped the US, make their way to Canada, then go to Cuba. They realize in Cuba that they're no longer able to seek exile refugee status there, because what they see is that the publication of fake Crusaders newsletter, which is what they're publishing, where it was a mimic of it, but it was language that they had not produced. And it was very much like, we're realizing that the production of these newsletters that in some ways paints in a certain light means that we're no longer safe. They were trying to find refuge anywhere else. China was not their first choice, but China was the one that was open and available at the time. So they went first in 62 to visit, and then they go back and move in 63. And in their case, they had to be very careful because it wasn't just him and his wife, also their two sons with them as well. So they were on the exile as a whole family, moving and navigating. And so for them, they were being watched, but people found different ways in as well. So for example, William Worthy, who was a reporter, the Pittsburgh Courier, he goes through Hong Kong to get into China. So they're finding ways to get into China, but they're in some ways risking a lot to make those travel. So, and we think about the geography and how they're going, it really speaks to what were they trying to leave and what was important to them to get out of this particular state. And by the time that Du Bois ended up leaving, he's an old man, but he's seen as like, he's 80, and they bring him back in front of House American Committee saying he's the most dangerous man in America. Someone's granddad is the most dangerous man. I mean, he's old, but it's like the idea of how they're framing these kind of conversations where he realized that this was no longer a space for him, where him and his wife do not return or not come back to the United States to live after that, where she stays in Ghana as well until her death in 1977, 78. But again, the idea they were being watched, they found ways to navigate those spaces to think about how to get to and from. Another example is an individual named R.B. Pankey, who was a contemporary of Paul Robeson. He's a performer, and he makes his way where he travels through different parts of Europe, makes his way to China, and then from there he makes his way to the German Democratic Republic, and he stays, in some ways in these spaces. So these individuals are very intentional, where in the GDR, there was actually a whole Black expat community there, where they actually had a whole community of individuals who were scholars, academics, and artists who were thinking through what does it mean to be Black expat, where the scholarship about when Dr. King goes to Berlin, he actually does have a chance to go over, and he actually meets with some of these individuals who live in GDR. So there was an awareness within these different circles of Black internationals of who was where, what was happening, what was going on. But they were where they've been watched, but they found ways of navigating those spaces and finding ways to get where they wanted to go. And for many of them, Ghana under Nkrumah was a safe spot, almost like a hub, if you will. In terms of thinking about how they were shaped by Beijing and how Beijing was shaped by these individuals. One thing I think that was really important is that in terms of thinking about Black politics in particular, there's always been a legacy of looking out in terms of internationalism, looking to Asia as a possible site of thinking about ideologies and also methods of, in some ways, protesting or moving against the then situation in the United States. And so there was the way in which Beijing was, in some ways, particular was in some ways connected to this legacy of colored solidarity, but also the legacies of the influence of the Communist Party, the CPUSA, with the African American community. So they had this kind of two, in some ways, kind of historic connections that the Beijing and Mao kind of tapped into to kind of say, we know there are these historical connections. And Mao was very intentional and very good about making those kind of connections happen through kind of cultural diplomacy. And one way they did was through music, the idea of using folk songs in China to kind of think about galvanizing people, but also make connections to Negro spirituals. And so that's how R.B. Pankey got to China. He saw Negro spirituals. So they're using music in different cultural connections. And this is how they're in some ways making an idea of how they've been shaped by Beijing, idea of thinking about the people, putting the people first, this ideas of what does that mean for politics. In terms of how they're shaped Beijing, one thing I talk about in the piece I wrote about Du Bois is that they're in some ways giving they're in some ways bringing the African-American individual back into these narratives. When think about the translation of Uncle Tom's Cabin and other literature, the Black American struggle is taken out. And in some ways, it's seen as a symbol or emblem of the Chinese diaspora. And so when they're going and they're talking about their experiences and they're having these conversations, they're bringing the Black individual and thinking about their struggles and giving more nuance to the conversations, where it's not just this one moment or this idea in conversation, but they're actually doing a lot to fill that history out. So again, going back to Pankey, he gives a program, a performance, and in the back of it, he has 2 paragraphs discussing slavery, what it is, discussing Negro spiritual, where they come from, and giving a different dimension to it. It goes beyond this one dimension of how they think about it. So I think on both sides, there is a dimension of, for African Americans, the idea of China, the Holland policies and what they're seeing of China in terms of the idea of this new China being shown around, in some ways gives them an idea of how we think about moving forward. But also on the China side, it's also in some ways bringing in the humaneness of African Americans in a way that goes beyond this symbol. There are some moments where there is misalignment in terms of thinking about, for example, these kind of conversations of what happens in these moments where, for example, the individuals who go into China are not always reporting back what they see, kind of the mishaps. So Williams is there, part of the Cultural Revolution, but he never talks about what he sees. You know, he sees later conversations in later interviews, he mentions that I see my son's teachers being paraded through the streets, but he never mentions that because the idea of possibility of China as a site of possibility and revolution in some ways might be greater than actual on ground, but he doesn't really report that. Not to mention the Chinese government is also publishing his newsletter, so his hands are tied because they're the ones who publishing it and circulating. So how much can he say in a space that's also his safe haven? So there are these moments where there are, you know, the ugliness of this moment is also kind of not always talked about in the moment itself. Does that answer
Very
your question?
interesting.
Okay.
Really interesting. Yes, sir. In the back, not all the way in the back, in front of the back, and then we'll get the person in the back.
G'day, my name's Emmett. I'm a student here, but also work with the public service. This might be a little bit out of scope, but we'll see. So it more pertains to the Chinese government scholarship programs with Africa. So the targeted programs that seem quite effective and seem to be having around 50,000 African students over there in China. So I was curious as to what you think about some of the parallels in terms of that cultural exploration between these types of more structured programs and the history of African American experience, but also particularly in the context of social media. In your introduction, you mentioned particularly last year and perhaps in 2020, some of the racial tensions that were publicised, particularly in Guangzhou and some other cases. So I'm interested to hear on whether you think the pervasiveness of social media will undo some of that good work, or not just the pervasiveness, but also the lack of effective censors for that type of speech will potentially undo a lot of that good work.
Thank you. So thinking about the Chinese government scholarship programs, this idea of how we think about cultural exchange, right? What does it mean to think about these kind of conversations and who are there? This is not necessarily something new. If we look at, go back to the work of people like Emmanuel Heavy, he writes about an African in China that goes back to I want to say the 70s. So there is a history of African students going to China. So there is a long legacy that they're tapping into. Originally, it was primarily students who were sons, usually sons of diplomats or those who were in governmental positions in various countries, but it's expanded over the last couple of decades. But I think there is also thinking about the ways in which these racial tensions happen is also not new as well. If you go back and look at when they were having the Tiananmen Square movements in the 80s, there was also unfortunately undertone in different cities and places, including limited to Shanghai, where many students, African students studying in China, were also targeted to the point where many had to leave. And so there is still this history of openness, but also limitation that goes back for this kind of tension. And so I'm thinking that one thing I hope that we learn from this kind of particular moment of 2020 is that we don't always keep going back to this idea of who has access, and also thinking about the ways in which Blackness and Black skin is also racialized in a way that's negative. And so I'm hoping that in some cases that social media is not necessarily undermining, it's just some ways highlighting that there's still at the everyday organic level, some conversations to be had about how we think about the other in these moments. What I'm kind of excited to see though is that there are a lot of NGOs, other groups in China that are sponsored by different individuals that are trying to in some ways increase cultural awareness to where we have this idea at the everyday individual level, a greater understanding. So it's not always the idea where we are antagonistic towards each other. So for example, I had a chance to work with two grad students who are in school in China, had a production program, and it was very much talking about looking at the ways in which we see kind of racism online. So looking at the kind of Han chauvinism, the kind of conversation, how we unpack that and think about it, and how that in some ways was made accessible to people. Groups like Black Liberty China, who are doing programs, they have an annual Africa Day where people come from all over in Beijing come and have these programs. So I think there is an awareness that there needs to be more conversations where not just living in China together, but we actually have community engagement. And so I'm hoping that that level of involvement will hopefully shift the narrative more so than social media will. Does that help answer? Okay, thank you.
And then in the back, then get you next, in the way back, and then over here.
Right. Hi. Yeah, so I think my question was just around, I think you mentioned, the fact that Xi Jinping's government doesn't really seem to want to support, contemporary, civil, social justice movements at the moment. I think this is probably more of me speaking from an Australian context, but I assume it's sort of relevant for other Western countries, including the United States as well. Just like, when the Chinese government supports something, or it seems that way nowadays, it kind of, sort of like Chinese government support sort of been tainted in a way. Like when the Chinese government puts support behind something, it's sort of saying, oh, that's foreign interference, that's not a good idea. We shouldn't be supporting that. You can sort of see, all that, stuff that's happening with the Labour Party here, Confucius Institutes and things like that. Is there any way in which, the Chinese government could meaningfully support social justice movements without, causing those movements to lose popular support or to, sort of diminish the cause unintentionally?
Ooh, that's a big question. So I'm thinking through this on two different scales, both domestically in China, but also internationally. And I think those go hand in hand to where if they're going to try to support movements internationally, that might cause uproar domestically in terms of the way in which the domestic movements have been handled, but also and so I think there has to be a intentional way of thinking about how do we in some ways engage in grassroots collaborative organizations in a way that also they don't see them as trying to undermine the central organization and the central authority, the CCP. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening anytime soon in terms of the way in which the Xi Jinping regime is moving forward. Not to say it won't happen, but it has to be where they're going to have to think about critically the ways in which they're engaging domestic movements, but also how to also think about it as well. Because we think about the way they're shaping different international movements, they're not always painting them in the most positive light either, where they might mention something about the Black Lives Matter movement, but it may also be they're in some ways reusing or rehashing some of the negative ways in which it's been talked about in the American press as well. So they might mention it and say, in a certain framing, we know it exists. We also know it's a problem in America, but also we're not supporting them as well because idea of it's anarchy, this is why democracy doesn't work, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's going to be where right now for the CCP, I don't think is supporting their overall agenda. And I don't think it's going to happen. But if it does, it's going to have to happen on both the domestic and the foreign level to where they're really critically engaging to think about what are the issues at risk, what are the issues underlying these particular movements, and are they willing to actually address those in a way that is going to lead to long-term engagement? I'm not sure where Xi Jinping falls on that, but it has to be done at some point because if they're thinking about the expansion of China in terms of this idea of global China and going into the global South, there are going to be questions about this as they're moving more to different nations, especially nations where the majority of people are of Black descent, where they're looking at China, looking at what happened in Guangzhou to try to see, is this the best move for us? Because of how ways in which they might say one thing, but then when it comes to on the ground action, is this also going to be replicated here in our own country as well? So there's going to have to be a moment of reckoning. When that happens, I'm not sure though, but it has to happen. But we'll see if not sure it's going to unfold, but.
I think the Chinese soft power campaign is going to be badly, badly undermined by Xi Jinping's social mobilization and propaganda campaign, but overseas Chinese students, huge basis for grassroots and other understanding. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jenny. I work for ABC. I actually really resonate.
Australian
broadcasting,
not American broadcasting company.
Yeah, the Australian one. I actually really resonate because I studied in Beijing. I also resonate with like the best conversation over Tra and Qingdao, right? So I really, really see that. So I have two questions. How are the experiences of Africans in China different from the African Americans in China? And the second question is, What do you see are the main challenges facing Sino-Black relations in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. So thinking about some of the challenges or differences between Africans, China, and African Americans in China. One of the differences historically has been the question of nationality, where for many generations, the American, that little blue passport, in some ways gives you different access and privileges in different ways that we did not always see for African students. Not to mention how in many cases the American students were recruited and engaged and kind of encouraged to come. That has shifted in around 1980s, where we see a shift where there's more recruitment of African students. And now it's a matter of numbers, where many students from different parts of the continent are going to China to study, to learn, to make their graduate, undergraduate, even postgraduate work and research there, where we don't see as much from African Americans in this kind of current context. And so in many cases, a matter of numbers, where in many cases now the idea of if you go as an African American, it's like you're a little bit rare because it's not that many of us, unfortunately, in terms of numbers. But in many cases, the experiences are similar in terms of cultural expression, trying to find different how people treat you in terms of wanting to touch your skin, wanting to touch your hair, asking questions about certain things. We have those moments where somehow you're seen as fascinating. I'm not sure why, but also sometimes a little bit different because unfortunately there are different stereotypes attached to sometimes African students that African American students do not have. In many cases, there are also the negative stereotype of, I've heard for a lot of my colleagues who went to China to study, where you're coming here to take from us, et cetera, those kind of narratives that can be very negative in spite of the growing interest of China within African nations as well. So there's a lot of different stereotypes attached where they have to navigate different conversations than African-American students do because somehow that Americanness, that if we do get afforded that privilege to be seen as Americans, allows people to see a little bit differently in different lights and different contexts. In terms of main challenges of Sino-Black relations, I think the new challenges arising now is that there are many conversations recently regarding various nations, including African nations, thinking about the agency in its role and how they're in some ways negotiating and engaging with China, where we think about one, Africa is not a monolith. Thinking about the continent in the different countries and how they're engaged with China differently, but also how they're all asserting their own agency and thinking about what does it mean to be engaging with China and how that's also being replicated in the Caribbean and other places as well, to where in many cases there's not a one-size-fits-all model. And this is going to be a space where for many nations, Black nations, they have a space to really think about, negotiate, and engage with China in a different way. And China's got to really think about its engagement as well in a new way that they have maybe not thought about before in the last 10 or 15 years, because there's a lot of conversation about agency and negotiation, pushing back. One of the most amazing things I heard about when doing this working group was that the overall sense is that the majority of the population in the continent is very young. And so these are the next generations and how they're seeing what's happening now and how they're going to shape those policies. And this is going to be interesting to see in the next 10, 15 years. Not to mention there's a shift where many students who are of African descent are going to China to study. They're not staying in China. They're going back to their home countries and they're bringing those insights and knowledge as well. So there's going to be a shift in these engagements where it's going to be a more nuanced conversation between these countries and China in a way that I think is going to be exciting to see. And it kind of in some ways goes against what kind of challenges this conversation about African countries taking whatever China gives them, and in some ways ignores the fact that there is a thought process and negotiation in that moment, how we think about those conversations. So I think it's going to be in some ways exciting to see, not to mention in terms of thinking about the Black diaspora more broadly and thinking about the United States African Americans. There is a new push because now we realize that China is not going away, and there's a huge push in some ways to find ways to build community where a lot of scholars, myself included, we find ourselves being alone, but now we know there's a community out there. And so finding ways to support, encourage, and build a new pipeline, building more Asian studies programs at HBCUs, at MSIs more broadly, and thinking about how we in some ways diversify the China space, but Asian space more broadly as well.
It is interesting when you look at polls like Pew, there's been a sharp deterioration in global views of China, except in Africa. So tell us about your students at Tennessee State, and what are they interested in, and what animates them when you're introducing them to China and to Asia more broadly? We know anime, we know manga with Japan, but what about China?
So it's interesting because usually I start them at the freshman level where I introduce them to China through the diaspora. I'm looking at the coolie trade, thinking about my global cultures and history course, but I introduce them to it. In my upper division courses, I have, of course, it's a special topics for my 3,000, so my junior level students and all my students in undergrad, where I introduced them through African American history. In my department, we have a very strong African American history center. I have two amazing colleagues who Dr. Williams, Dr. Ewan, who do very great work on African American history. And so the students know that history, but don't know about African American history and Black internationalism. And so I have a course that's voted to Black internationalism particularly, but through the lens of Black women's internationalism. Also had a course that was a special topics looking at the questions of race, ethnicity, through East and Southeast Asia. So taking out of the American context, making them expand their thinking, to think about these kind of conversations where they know what it means to feel racialized, but no, they're not understanding the concepts and theories behind race and racism, where had many students are like, I thought I understood race, and then I took your class, and I was like, good, I'm gonna break it down and bridge it back up. And so thinking about it in the kind of external context in light and in conjunction with colonialism and those kind of conversations. And so I try to introduce them to the idea of China as not an enigma and not a monolith, but as a place of insight exploration. I'm looking at it from cultural lens, politics as well. And so in my, for example, my modern Chinese history course, we look at it through the lens of cultural and social issues through race and gender. It allows them to some ways see Chinese people, and it helps them see the kind of people along with the state itself. So China is a government, but also the people and the cultures that make it up and see the changes over time. And that has been helpful because it helps them kind of break down their own misconceptions, especially like that kind of the current press, but also helps them see what China is, how China is constructed, but also gives them their own sense of understanding of China. And so it helps them to kind of really rethink where what they thought they knew, they in some ways were like, I really did not understand all the different levels and dimensions. And so it allows them to think through their own understanding. So I try to be their guide in some ways to kind of help them see it's not just this other, how it's been some ways talked about in the press. We kind of go from beyond that othering, how we've thought about othering, go beyond in ways how we see this kind of Orientalist view in the press and think about China in its own context and culture.
Well, in a different context, in a different way, I think what you described, you just did for us tonight. So thank you. It was really interesting. I think everybody's thinking about China and the US and identity a little differently now. It's just, again, as an international relations scholar, it's increasingly becoming an essential part of not just the history discipline, but international relations, comparative politics, to really try to understand and capture these transnational, subnational narratives, and because they're huge, the impact at the end of the day, when you look for them, they're huge. So you've helped us understand it wonderfully, Keisha. Thank you. I don't know if you have dinner plans. Maybe you can hang out for a little bit, talk to people individually, but we'll end the formal program. So please join me in thanking Dr. Keisha Brown.
Thank you.